Today we're going to be discussing a series of conflicts that occurred in the 1930s and 1940s in the Chinese-controlled Central Asian region of Xinjiang, also known by some as East Turkestan. Now, there is a lot to unpack here regarding the history of the region and what was going on here at the time. So I will be specifically covering the subject of the Kazakh conflict in Xinjiang, one of the many conflicts plaguing Xinjiang, and really the entire western frontier of China during this time period, and specifically this conflict's impact on neighboring Tibet. So first off, I'm going to commence today's segment with a brief backstory regarding the political turmoil that was plaguing Xinjiang during this time. For those of you unfamiliar, Xinjiang is basically China's northwest frontier province, the part of China that borders most of the Stan countries of Central Asia: Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Afghanistan, and a good part of Pakistan. To the west is Mongolia and Qinghai province, also known as Amdo province of northeast Tibet, and to the south is the Tibet Autonomous Region. So Xinjiang is literally at the crossroads of Central Asia and East Asia. And during the 1930s and 1940s, this place was in absolute mayhem, reflected in the many armed conflicts that were occurring here at the time as a result of multiple political factions vying for power and dominance in Xinjiang. One thing before I commence any further, Xinjiang is officially known as the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. I actually think that can be easily misinterpreted because, well, directly south of Xinjiang, what do we have? We have the Tibet Autonomous Region, designated for the Tibetan ethnic group. So when people hear Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, they can easily misconstrue that it is the one true homeland of the Uyghurs, because that's the case of Tibet, where Tibetans remain the dominant ethnic group. That is not exactly the case in Xinjiang, and as you will come to know, it really never has been. So, who are the Uyghurs? The modern Uyghur people for whom the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region is named derive their name from the Uyghur Khaganate, which was a Khaganate, or basically an empire or kingdom ruled by a Khagan, or basically a Khan. Well, the Uyghur Khaganate ruled over the central eastern part of what is now Xinjiang. This part of Xinjiang actually just represented what was just a remote far western part of this Uyghur Khaganate. The Uyghurs themselves originated around the central eastern parts of what is roughly modern-day Mongolia and Siberia, and they were the majority ethnic group of their empire before it fell to other groups, other empires like the Kyrgyz, and the Uyghurs were forced to be relegated around the far western reaches of their Khaganate, which would come to be Xinjiang. So the best analogy I can think of is to imagine the nation of Canada were to crumble and every Canadian citizen in the country from Vancouver to Montreal had to flee to Nova Scotia or Newfoundland and establish a new state there. That's basically what happened to the Uyghur Khaganate. Well, before the Uyghurs, there was actually another ethnic group living in the southern part of Xinjiang, the Tarim Basin, and that group was known as the Tokharians. And the Tokharians were actually an Indo-European ethnic group, and like I said, they were native to just the southern part of Xinjiang, the Tarim Basin. So the modern-day Uyghur ethnic group is actually a result of ethnogenesis between the original Uyghur Turks from Mongolia and Siberia with the ancient indigenous Indo-European Tokharians. And that is why today, if you see Uyghurs, they look quite mixed as opposed to the Mongolian or Siberian appearance that their ancestors who founded the Uyghur Khaganate probably had. So that is the background of who the Uyghurs are. But you have to remember the Uyghurs are historically indigenous to the southern part of Xinjiang, the Tarim Basin, as we said. Today, we're going to be focused on the northern part of Xinjiang, where we have the Dzungarian Basin, named after the Dzungar Oirat Mongols who had ruled much of modern Xinjiang and also Kazakhstan for centuries until their extermination by the Qing dynasty in the 1700s. And we did talk a bit about the Dzungar Mongols in our previous video about the Hoshut Khanate. Well, this northern part of Xinjiang, the Dzungarian Basin, encompasses much of what is now known as Ili Kazakh Autonomous Prefecture, which is an autonomous prefecture within Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, which, as you could gather, is designated for the Kazakh ethnic group. And in fact, now that we have commenced this topic, the entire southwest part of Xinjiang consists of Bayingolin Mongolian Autonomous Prefecture, who are mostly descendants of the Oirat Mongols who had migrated to the region, as we discussed in our video on the Hoshut Khanate. And then we also have Kyrgyz Kitsilsu Autonomous Prefecture, and also Tashkorgan Tajik Autonomous Prefecture, designated for those respective ethnic groups. There are also a great number of ethnic Chinese Muslims, known as the Hui or Tongans, many of whom have been living there for centuries. So Xinjiang is known to be an extremely ethnically diverse region, and this was far more so the case back in the 1930s and 1940s. So during this time period, as we said earlier, Xinjiang is in complete political turmoil. In 1911, about 20, 30 years before the period we'll be discussing, the Xinhai Revolution resulted in the collapse of China's last dynasty, the Qing, and the establishment of the Republic of China, which exists to this day in Taiwan. This resulted in a decade of agitations, revolts, and uprisings in every province of China. In Xinjiang in particular, the conflict manifested itself as a war for independence by the various Muslim ethnic groups for their own autonomy. Think of the Balkans times 50, because Xinjiang is probably 50 times bigger than the Balkans. And there you will have 1920s to 1940s Xinjiang. The military conflicts that result from the mayhem in Xinjiang during this time period are collectively known as the Xinjiang Wars. And the Xinjiang Wars consist of many rebellions, revolts, battles, massacres, and ultimately even a Soviet invasion of Xinjiang in 1934. But out of all the conflicts that comprised the Xinjiang Wars, which were many conflicts, today we're going to focus our attention on one of the very last official conflicts of the Xinjiang Wars, which happened in the aftermath of World War II, and this was known as the Ili Rebellion. This conflict occurred in the aforementioned Kazakh majority northern part of Xinjiang, and looking at the map, it is the region of northern Xinjiang that separates eastern Kazakhstan from western Mongolia. And to this day, the region retains a Kazakh majority, and the population consists of both indigenous Kazakh nomads whose ancestors had mostly settled there during the Qing dynasty in the wake of the collapse of the Dzungar Mongols, and also refugees who came more recently from the modern state of Kazakhstan as a result of the conflict contemporaneous with the Ili Rebellion, known as the Basmachi Revolt. Now, the Basmachi Revolt was an uprising that engulfed multiple Russian-occupied states in Central Asia against, at first, the Russian Empire's rule under the Tsar, and then after the Russian Revolution, which resulted in the collapse of the Russian Empire and the establishment of the Soviet Union, it became a revolt against the Soviets. And the revolts were waged by the Turkic mostly Muslim ethnic groups of Central Asia, mainly the Kazakhs and the Kyrgyz, and also the Uzbeks, and it took place quite literally at Xinjiang's doorstep. The aftermath of the Basmachi Revolt left hundreds of thousands of Kazakhs and Kyrgyz massacred and persecuted as a result of the uprising against Russian rule, and many decided to flee over the border into Xinjiang, and that was how their numbers exploded in Xinjiang and how they became very dominant ethnic groups there. Interesting thing about the Basmachi Revolt, in my opinion, is that it could be seen as a Chinese counterpart of the Ili Rebellion. So while the Ili Rebellion was an uprising by the Turkic peoples of Xinjiang or East Turkestan against mostly the Republic of China, the Basmachi Revolt was a uprising against the Russians, no matter which government was ruling, by the Turkic peoples of Central Asia. What was ironic, however, was that the separatist Turkic rebels in the Ili Rebellion were being supported by the very ones who had persecuted their brethren right across the border, the Soviet Union. But we'll get to that in a bit. Ultimately, the Ili Rebellion culminated in the establishment of the Second East Turkestan Republic. The First East Turkestan Republic had been established a decade earlier as a result of the Kumul Rebellion, another major revolt that comprised the Xinjiang Wars in 1933 and fell in 1934. Now, despite both of these polities having this distinction of being the only East Turkestan republics to have ever existed, the name is really where their similarities end. So the First East Turkestan Republic had been established by Uyghur loyalists of the Kumul Khanate, which had been a semi-autonomous Khanate bordering southwestern Mongolia within the Qing dynasty and the Republic, then afterwards the Republic of China, before its abolishment by the latter. It was dominated by Uyghurs both in governance and its population demographics. Now, the Second East Turkestan Republic had almost nothing to do with the Kumul Khanate, and it was established as a Soviet-backed satellite state. Remember how I said it was ironic how the Turkic rebels in the Ili Rebellion were being supported by the ones who had persecuted their brethren across the border in the Soviet Union. Well, the Second East Turkestan Republic was based in the Kazakh-majority northern Ili region in the Dzungarian Basin, and the leadership, while it was dominated by Uyghurs like the First East Turkestan Republic, the population consisted mostly of Kazakhs. Dialing back to the Ili Rebellion, for the most part, the rebellion was an uprising by all the Turkic ethnic groups of northern Xinjiang against the Republican Chinese. But eventually there is discontent within the ranks. Some of the Kazakhs grow disillusioned with the Second East Turkestan Republic's leadership because, as we mentioned, the leadership of the Second East Turkestan Republic was dominated by Uyghurs who had no historical conflict with the Soviets or Russians, while the population mostly consisted of Kazakhs, many of whom were descendants of refugees fleeing Russian persecution. Uyghurs never really had a significant presence at all in the northern regions of Xinjiang, which encompassed the Second East Turkestan Republic. As it happens, no group that is the majority somewhere ever likes being lorded over by a minority, and lo and behold, a substantial number of Kazakhs turned against the East Turkestan Republic. Many of the Kazakhs of this region followed their leader, the charismatic, semi-legendary Osman Batur. Osman initially fought with the Second East Turkestan Republic and was virulently anti-Chinese, but switched sides to the Republic of China eventually. As we mentioned, the Ili Rebellion results in the rebels being victorious and the establishment of the Second East Turkestan Republic, or ETR. Well, afterwards, they went after those who betrayed or opposed them. So the leaders of the ETR start going after Osman Batur and all 20,000 or so of his followers among the Kazakhs in the ETR who felt
disenfranchised by the Uyghur leadership. This results in a mass exodus of Kazakhs out of Xinjiang and into Tibet. And this is where our story for today begins. Now, you may wonder why the Kazakhs just didn't go back to Kazakhstan, where their, ancestors were from, or maybe even east to their new allies in mainland China. Well, to answer the first statement, if you've been following along until now, the Kazakhs obviously couldn't go back to Kazakhstan because the people who, for the reason for which their ancestors left Kazakhstan in the first place, are still there. The Soviets are still in control of Kazakhstan and are now a formidable presence in their new home in Xinjiang through the Second East Turkestan Republic. So, yeah, they can't go back to Kazakhstan. And at this time, China is in the midst of the Chinese Civil War and is also reeling from the war with Japan and is also, not to mention, very far away. So the Kazakhs decide to flee southwards through Tibet towards Kashmir, which was the nearest Islamic nation to Xinjiang, and more importantly, also ruled by the British. And I'm assuming, or I'm sure, in Osman's mind, who better to flee as a refugee and from violence than the British as opposed to the Soviets or the Chinese. Now, the title of today's segment is called The Kazakh Invasion of Tibet. The reason I have titled this is not to suggest that the entire Kazakh Exodus from Xinjiang to Tibet, which consisted of many women, children, infirm, and elderly non-combatants fleeing persecution, constituted a military invasion. An exodus is a forced migration of people out of their homelands to flee persecution, disasters, whatever it may be, out of desperation. An invasion is an act of military aggression by one nation against another nation for the benefit of the former. Well, as you will come to hear from various written accounts that I will read in the upcoming minutes, by many researchers and travelers who actually followed and recorded the experiences, struggles, and successes of the Kazakhs as they transversed through Tibet. It is evident that groups of the Kazakhs entering Tibet at this time did resort to aggressive militaristic tactics and took actions characteristic of an invasive occupying military force. Not initially, by any means whatsoever, but over time, and primarily only as a result of desperation. So let's start with reading some excerpts from Kazakh Exodus by Mr. Godfrey Lias. Godfrey Lias was a British researcher and traveler in Tibet who documented the experiences of the Kazakhs as they left Xinjiang to transverse the Tibetan plateau and eventually reach Kashmir and from there on forth the free world. This is page 178 of Kazakh Exodus. Thus, the only alternatives the Free Kazakhs and Free Kazakhs refer to the 20,000 or so followers of Osman Batur debated where to stay and where they were and fight it out, and to fight their way through the hostile forces around them. Natural obstacles like the Taklamakan Desert, the Altin and Kunlun Mountains, and the Trans-Himalayas. Human ones, including not only the communists, but also the Tibetans, if they proved unfriendly. By this time, the Free Kazakhs numbered all told no more than 3,000 to 4,000 men, women, and children. And now I will read from pages 188 to 189 of Kazakh Exodus. When the remaining Kazakh leaders had an opportunity to take stock, they realized at once that the only course of action was to enter Tibet and fight their way to India if the Tibetans would not let them pass. And now I will summarize, rather than read, the contents of pages 197 to 198 of Kazakh Exodus. So these pages detail the plan the Kazakhs had in mind as they transversed through Tibet, and their plans to actually go to the Tibetan capital city of Lhasa. Actually, I will read an excerpt from page 197 of Kazakh Exodus, When the Kazakhs reached the high plateau which fringes the southern slopes of the Kunlun Mountains, they saw Tibetans watching them from the skyline. Ali Beg at once sent Hamza forward with a patrol to try and make contact with them and, if possible, friends, but the watches fled before he reached them. And I'm going to skip the next few lines over, but to fill you in, basically the Kazakhs have located a Tibetan village. There they find that the inhabitants are very hesitant to give the Kazakhs anything. And I'm going to continue reading. As they parleyed, Kazakh scouts saw men gathering on the outskirts of the village with arms in their hands, evidently making ready to attack. So the Kazakhs, being too few in number and too exposed a place to wait for their onslaught, attacked the Tibetans without delay, and having put them to flight without much difficulty, took what food they needed and then set fire to the village, which by this time had emptied itself of inhabitants. They proceeded on their way with the 2 Tibetans who had taken them to the village, still guiding them. Second paragraph, same page, page 197. The guides undertook to lead them to the road which Ali Beg hoped to follow to Lhasa, where indeed he knew that Salis and Yolbars planned to go when they left Gizkul in September 1950. At that time, the communists had not yet occupied Tibet, though some apparently arrived around the same time as Salis and Yolbars. And Yolbars refers to Yolbars Khan, who was a prominent Uyghur leader, originally on the side of the East Turkestan Republic, before shifting sides and joining Osman's followers. And I believe from the pages I read earlier, Salis is another Kazakh leader. But onwards reading. But when Ali Beg got there in late February 1951, he did not know that the communists were already in the country, and he followed the 2 Tibetan guides without misgiving, hoping that the road would lead him and his parties first to Lhasa and then across the waste of Tibet to Nepal and so to India. Now I'm going to skip ahead to the bottom of page 198 to the very last paragraph. So shortly beforehand, the 2 Tibetan guides for the Kazakhs tricked them and leave the Kazakhs stranded and into an ambush by a Tibetan militia. Going to the top of the hills, which bordered the valley of the reeds, Ali Beg saw the road in the distance, and on it, bodies of armed men going in the direction of Lhasa. Recognizing them at once as communist soldiers, Ali Beg realized that the 2 Tibetans had planned a double treachery. First, the ambush by their own people, and if that failed, to deliver the Kazakhs into the hands of the communists. And now this is page 202. They journeyed first through sparsely inhabited country, and all the Tibetans they met were hostile. Some were villagers and some nomads, but the Kazakhs no longer tried to make friends with any of them, and treated all alike as foes, as the children of Israel were told to do when entering the Promised Land after their 40 years in the wilderness. So, when the Kazakhs needed food or fodder, they took it. I think, too, that if they came across any domestic animals, but not yaks, they took them too, especially sheep. Once or twice about this time, they saw other small groups of Kazakhs from Gizkul, making for Kashmir like themselves. Page 204, where Lias details another battle between the Kazakhs and Tibetans. As he turned, hidden Tibetans opened fire on him, and immediately several hundred soldiers dashed out of the defile below on horseback, waving drawn swords and shouting as they galloped towards the long, straggling line of Kazakhs. The attack was entirely unexpected, but the Kazakhs were ready for the charging horsemen before they arrived. The men and boys turned their horses towards the enemy, waving their own swords and nailed billets of wood, while the women and children, unbidden, turned their beasts away from entering the defile and shepherded them past it along the main valley. Thus, in a matter of moments, there was a screen of mounted men between the Kazakh column and the charging Tibetans. Long before Ali Beg had ridden back down the hill, his men had countercharged and were among the Tibetans. The yelling warriors rode up and down, slashing and cutting at one another from their saddles till the light faded when the Tibetans withdrew, leaving the Kazakhs in triumphant possession of the battlefield. The victors bound up their wounds as best they could after bathing them in urine to prevent festering. Then they buried their 3 dead comrades, selected the best of the Tibetan weapons to add to their own stocks, destroying the rest, tied the best of the Tibetan horses to their own, and set off to join their womenfolk who were waiting for them in the main valley. This is page 205. The first sign that the communists were in the neighborhood was when the Kazakhs suddenly found they were being followed by communist ground troops, acting on this occasion, at any rate, in full cooperation with the local inhabitants, who doubtless regarded the Kazakhs as an even worse infliction than the communists. Yet, judging from the fact that some of the other Kazakh refugees from Gezkul were well received by the Tibetans, it is possible that Ali Beg's party was mistaken for communists when it entered the country. If so, the communists profited fortuitously and undeservedly from a genuine and unfortunate misunderstanding. Page 208. Ali Beg left half his 30 men at the head of the pass with orders to hold it if the communists rallied, while he himself hurried back to the main body with the rest. He found it still moving very slowly towards the head of the third pass, with a screen composed mostly of women and boys out in front in case the Tibetans should attack, before Hamza and Kainesh outclimbed the ambushers and put them to flight. Telling his 15 men to join the screen and to press on towards the head of the pass as soon as they heard firing ahead of them, but carefully lest there should be Tibetan sharpshooters above them, Ali Beg found himself a vantage point from which he could use his field glasses to make sure that the enemy could not come at him from a flank. It was a clear day, and the grim mountains all round were bare except for patches of snow. Page 209. Presently, he heard the sound of firing from the head of Pass 3. With the help of his field glasses, he saw the explosion of hand grenades which Hamza's men were dropping on the Tibetans, and in the scurry of frantic men as the Tibetans, who had never met hand grenades before, jumped from boulder to boulder, seeking cover from which to fire at their assailants, only to find themselves exposed to Kainesh's men who shot them from behind. The pass being narrow, the Tibetans who were screened from Hamza's men were in full view of Kainesh's and vice versa. They did not wait to be picked off one by unseen assailants, and the second battle, like the first, was over in a few minutes without the Kazakhs having suffered a single casualty. They immediately went forward again, sending messengers to bid the rear guard give up its watch and follow the main body, though at a suitable distance, so that it could give warning if the communists reappeared. They did not reappear, at least not then. There were 5 or 6 clashes with the Tibetans and 2 more with the communists while the Kazakhs were crossing Tibet. All of them occurred within the first 2.5 months. All the time, the party went steadily forward, averaging about 15 to 20 miles a day. But it was now approaching the region in which progress was impeded by mountain mists which engulfed everything for days on end, setting tempers on edge and making it impossible to stir from the encampment, lest the one who did so should never find it again. This is page 211. So this is when the band of Kazakhs finally reached the border with India and their interactions with the Indian border guard. The Indian replied shortly that he knew nothing about the communists who had not yet appeared on his sector of the country. Looking over the ragged, unkempt, armed band in front of him, he saw that they were obviously not Tibetans, and equally certainly not Chinese. The Rudot road was not the normal one by which people from Xinjiang would seek to enter India. Moreover, the Tibetans had warned him about a band of brigands who had entered Tibet from the north and had pillaged many villagers, killing the inhabitants and carrying off women and valuables before turning westward toward Kashmir. He concluded that Ali Beg's party were the brigands in question. "We are no bandits," Ali Beg replied, "and indeed we are political refugees, as I told you, though we have had to fight our way through Tibet to reach this place, and this may have seemed banditry to the Tibetans, though there was naught else we could do, seeing that they refused to help us or let us pass." And now we will conclude our readings of Kazakh Exodus here on page 217, and it goes on to explain what happened to the Kazakhs after entering India from Tibet. The party spent altogether 52 days waiting on the Tibetan side of the frontier before being allowed to enter Kashmir, though Muhammad Emin Bugra, the Turki leader who was living in Srinagar, hurried to Delhi to appeal personally on their behalf to Mr. Nehru himself as soon as he heard of their arrival. They fought 6 battles with the communists between Gizkul and the Indian frontier, and 2 more while waiting for permission to cross. They also had 3 clashes with Tibetans. Of the 234 persons who set out with Ali Beg from Gizkul, 175 came through safely. They lost 1,100 sheep, 60 horses, 37 cows, and 45 camels in the fighting and from malnutrition and sickness, apart from those they killed for food. I was unable to get accurate figures for the other groups, but I estimate that about 2,800 Kazakhs started from Gizkul, and between 1,500 and 1,800 reached Kashmir. Some of these are still in India. On the other hand, some Kazakhs who had been living in India and Pakistan for years joined the Gizkul refugees when they went to Turkey, where other Kazakhs from East Turkestan went as many as 20 years ago and have become quite prosperous, though not as shepherds, but as merchants. I actually want to share with you an excerpt from a much better known piece of literature than Kazakh Exodus, a book that actually has a Hollywood film adaptation with Brad Pitt, and that is, of course, 7 Years in Tibet. This is the famous written account by Heinrich Harrer, the Austrian explorer, about his experiences in Tibet. And this is page 109 of 7 Years in Tibet. Taken for Kazakhs, a Central Asian tribe whose members migrated in swarms during the war from Soviet Russia to Tibet. They marched in with their families and flocks and plundered right and left, and the Tibetan army was at pains to drive them on into India. The Kazakhs are often fair-skinned and blue-eyed, and their beards grow normally. And that was, of course, 7 years in Tibet. So it was obvious that the Kazakh situation in Tibet was significant enough for Heinrich to have heard about it during his conversations with Lhasa officials. Now for another book by a Japanese agent who was coincidentally in Tibet around the same time as Heinrich, and that was Hisao Kimura. He has a book called Japanese Agent in Tibet, My 10 Years of Travel in Disguise. And he's basically, more or less, the lesser-known Japanese version of Heinrich Harrer. Here is an excerpt from the book where Kimura has a conversation with the Tibetan Lama in Qinghai or Amdo. This land is very unsettled compared with Inner Mongolia to the west. The Kazakhs persecute our people, and we are powerless to stop them. Therefore, I advise you to leave for your native land as soon as you have finished whatever you came to do. Otherwise, leave for Tibet. In that holy land, there is peace. And elsewhere in the book, Kimura talks about how the Kazakhs were plundering and robbing areas all throughout Amdo. Well, at this time, Amdo is actually ruled as Qinghai province by a Republic of China affiliated Chinese Muslim warlord named Ma Bufang. And there is a whole entire segment that I can do just on this one individual and his relationship with the Tibetans of Amdo, which was not a good one, but we can get to that later. Basically, the Kazakhs enter Qinghai from Xinjiang and Gansu, as we already knew from all the reading from Kazakh Exodus, And initially, Ma Bufang accepts them and actually settles the Kazakh nomads in demarcated pasture lands in 1941, 3 years before the major influx of Kazakhs into Tibet following the Ili Rebellion. So Ma Bufang, by settling the Kazakhs from Xinjiang in Qinghai, literally takes away land from local Tibetans, Mongols, and Chinese Muslims. And these groups, well, mostly the Tibetans and Mongols against the Chinese Muslims and vice versa, had previously been frequently at war with one another. Well, now they finally found common ground and unite against what they perceive to be a mutual threat. So battles between the Kazakhs and the local Mongols, Tibetans, and Chinese Muslims become so frequent that this period and this location could be characterized as a war zone in this part of Tibet. According to an American agent who was exploring the region at the time named Leonard Francis Clark, local Muslims told him about Kazakhs invading Tibet through the Altintag and Chilian mountains over the course of 8 years in the 1940s. According to them, the Kazakhs were responsible for massacring 8,000 Upper Mongols, and if you remember our video about the Hoshur Khanate, the Upper Mongols are the descendants of the Oirat and Khalkha Mongol tribes who migrated to northeast Tibet in the 15th and 16th centuries. Anyways, they claimed that this was only possible due to the Chinese nationalist government under Ma Bufang disarming the Tibetans and Mongols of the region. Over the space of 2 years of battles, 5,000 Kazakhs out of 18,000 who entered northeast Tibet were killed by the Tibetans and Chinese Muslims of Gansu. And just for your information, a part of the traditional northeast Tibetan province of Amdo is located in Gansu. The majority is in Qinghai, and a little bit is in Sichuan province of China, but a good part of it is in Gansu as well. Well, when the Kazakhs were debriefed by the British officials upon entering India, they accused Tibetans, especially the Golok tribe, and just like Ma Bufang's relationship with Tibetans, there is a whole segment I could do just on the Tibetan Golok tribe. Anyways, the Kazakhs also accused the Chinese Muslims of attacking them in northeast Tibet, and further accused Ma Bufang's government of ignoring these attacks on them. And the reason I'm bringing all this up is so that everybody knows the Kazakhs weren't always the sole aggressors in these conflicts. Like I said at the beginning, there were many women, children, elderly, and infirm individuals among them as well. So up until now, the reason I've brought all of this up is because it seems to me that every Western traveler in Tibet during this time period, during the 1930s, 1940s, and even 1950s, mentions or at least was familiar with the Kazakh incursions in Tibet and the seriousness that the Tibetan government was considering it with. Last but not least, we have Into Tibet by the late Thomas Laird. And I would say, besides Kazakh Exodus, this book is probably the most informative work that you can find about the Kazakh presence in Tibet during this period. So this book follows the story of Douglas McKiernan, who has the distinction of being the first officer of the American CIA, yes, the Central Intelligence Agency, to have been killed in the line of duty. Douglas was dispatched to Xinjiang to gather intelligence on the East Turkestan Republic and Soviet involvement in the region. McKiernan was shot dead by Tibetan border guards because he was mistook for being a Kazakh entering Tibet from Xinjiang. So clearly the conflict between the Tibetans and Kazakhs had become so dire and severe that Tibetan soldiers had standing orders to shoot any Kazakh who attempted to enter Tibet. So this certainly must have been a tumultuous period of hardship for the Tibetan populations of the regions that the Kazakhs were traveling through, and certainly for the Kazakhs themselves. So here on pages 144 to 145 of Into Tibet, it reads, "That winter, the Whitebeards decided to ban the traditional raids on the camps of other nomads. Young Kazakh men traditionally raided Mongols or Tibetan nomads, going on raids as distant as several months' round trip in order to steal sheep, horses, camels, yaks, or children. Animals stolen on a raid were the most highly respected form of bride price. It paid for the bride with panache by demonstrating the manly powers of the groom. During the winter of 1949 to 1950, in the face of the invading Chinese, the Whitebeards took a diplomatic step to try to unite all the different nomadic tribal groups of Inner Asia. The young men were not impressed by the idea they had to work together with those they had previously always raided. Young men galloped wildly in from the horizon, laughing and whooping as they came to Hussein's yurt in the center of the Owl. Frank Basak, watching the performance for the first time, thought someone was going to get hurt. Instead, to everyone's amazement, these daredevils slung themselves down under the bellies of their galloping mounts. When the horses came to an abrupt halt in front of the yurt, the watching crowd, drawn out by the ruckus, appreciated the grace with which the young men seemed to fall off their horses. That winter, some young men ignored the edict of the Whitebeards. A week's ride away, a group of Mongols, whom the Kazakh had pushed out of Timur-Lake only a decade earlier, were preparing to move their herds north across the Kunlun Mountains into Tibet. The Mongols were already afraid the communist Chinese would destroy their nomadic lifestyle as the Chinese took control of Xinjiang. The Kazakh raiders from Timur-Lake swept into the Mongol camp, killed 2 people, and galloped out again with hundreds of head of livestock. There was no triumphant return from the raid. The young men had, after all, undermined any unity among the nomads in the face of the Chinese invasion. Instead, upon their return, the young men crept up in the night and tied a few head of sheep or goats to the yurts of many people in Timur-Lake. That was the only public announcement of their successful raid. Even the Americans found a sheep tied to their tent when they woke up the next morning. Basak and Vasily Zvantsov noticed another result of such raids. There were several Tibetans at Timur-Lake who acted and dressed like Kazakh. They had been kidnapped on raids into Tibet over the past decade. Tibetans to the north would be primed to shoot anyone who looked Kazakh.
Keep in mind, we're talking about the Tibetan Plateau, so we're talking about almost 2.5 million square kilometers of territory, or almost 1 million square miles of territory. So clearly the Kazakh Exodus into Tibet was not a small-scale situation. Today, the only surviving trace of the Kazakh presence on the Tibetan Plateau exists in Aksai Kazakh Autonomous County, which is located in Gansu Province, and it borders Subay Mongol Autonomous County, which, if you recall our previous video about the Khoshur Khanate, this county was established by Upper Mongol refugees from northeast Tibet who were fleeing Tibetan reprisals after the collapse of the Khoshur Khanate's power. About 41.3% of Aksai's total population of 10,545 individuals remain ethnically Kazakh, and they are all descended from the Kazakh Exodus into Tibet from Xinjiang. Interestingly enough, both Aksai and Subay were established by populations fleeing reprisals in Tibet, kind of like Bhutan or Ladakh, but on the complete other side of the Tibetan Plateau. In sharing the story of the Kazakh Exodus into Tibet, my intention is not to stir division or revisit old conflicts, but to shine a light on a complex chapter of history often overlooked. This migration, shaped by the overlapping interests of powerful nations like the Soviet Union, China, India, Britain, and the United States, carried profound consequences for countless lives whose stories must be heard. Thank you all for watching Eclectic Explorations. If you enjoyed this deep dive and want more content like this, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. It's the best way to stay in the loop on all our latest videos, and it helps support the channel so we can keep bringing you new stories and insights. Thanks again, and I'll see you in the new one.